The CIA analyst stared at the transcript for 11 minutes before he said anything. His name was Gerald Foss. He was 34 years old, had a doctorate in linguistics from Georgetown University, had spent 6 years breaking Soviet communications, had personally contributed to the decryption of 3 separate North Vietnamese Army cipher systems, and he was holding a piece of paper that made him feel like a man who had spent his entire career learning to swim and had just been told the ocean did not work the way he thought. He put the paper down. He picked it up again. He read the line that had stopped him. Bluey's bat hit a 6. Reckon the crease is about 4 cunts past the big bastard tree. Maybe 6 bastards north of where Davo chucked his stubby. Foss held very still. He was a careful man, methodical. He did not panic. He did not jump to conclusions. He had been trained at enormous institutional expense to approach anomalous data with clinical detachment. He looked at the line again. He underlined the word cunts. He underlined the word bastard. He underlined the word stubby. He drew a box around the phrase, hit a 6. He sat back in his chair and said, to nobody in particular, because he was alone in the room, "What in the name of God is this?" It was March of 1968. The location was a CIA forward signals analysis station outside Bien Hoa, South Vietnam. The transcript had been pulled from an intercepted Australian radio transmission. Voice traffic from a Special Air Service Regiment patrol operating in Phuoc Tuy province. The Australians had been in country for 2 years. The Americans had been monitoring their communications for almost as long, initially as a matter of standard Allied intelligence protocol, and then, increasingly, as a matter of personal bewilderment. Foss had been briefed on the Australian language problem before he arrived in Vietnam. He had read the reports. He had studied the vocabulary analyses. He understood, in the abstract, that Australian soldiers communicated in a vernacular that resisted conventional analytical methods. He had understood this the way a man understands that a particular mountain is cold before he climbs it. The understanding had not prepared him for the experience. The transmission in question had been recorded at 14:30, 7 hours, on a Tuesday afternoon. It was 6 minutes and 43 seconds long. In that time, the Australian patrol had transmitted what appeared to be a casual conversation between 3 soldiers. There was a discussion of cricket. There was a complaint about the heat. There was an extended argument about the relative merits of 2 different brands of Australian beer. And then, embedded in the middle of this apparently meaningless chatter, was a string of phrases that had caused Foss's entire analytical framework to quietly collapse. He did not know yet what the phrases meant. He would spend the next 9 months finding out. What he would discover, layer by layer, with the mounting disbelief of a man who keeps expecting the joke to end, was that the Australians had done something that no military communications manual had ever anticipated. They had not built a code. They had not designed a cipher. They had taken 3 entirely separate aspects of their cultural life, aspects that Americans found either baffling or offensive or both, and had woven them together into a targeting system so deeply embedded in ordinary Australian speech that it was functionally invisible to anyone outside the culture. The system had 3 components. Nobody had invented them. Nobody had approved them. Nobody had written them down. They worked perfectly. To understand the first component, you need to understand what cricket means to an Australian soldier. Not what cricket means to you, what it means to them. Cricket is not a sport in the way Americans understand sports. It is not something you follow on weekends. It is a language, a framework, a way of understanding the world. An Australian who has never played a single game of cricket can still use cricket terminology with automatic fluency, the way an American who has never been to church can still say something went to hell. The vocabulary is so deeply embedded in the culture that it functions below the level of conscious thought. And cricket vocabulary, it turned out, was extraordinarily useful for describing three-dimensional space. The crease is a line. The pitch is a measured distance. The boundary is a perimeter. A 6 is a maximum. A 4 is a near miss. A wicket is a specific point. The covers, the slips, the gully, the fine leg, the square leg. Each of these is a fielding position with a precise directional relationship to the pitch. Every Australian soldier knew these positions instinctively, the same way every American soldier knew the positions on a baseball diamond. Except that cricket had more positions, more specific positions. Positions that corresponded with remarkable precision to compass bearings. The man who first noticed this was not an intelligence officer. He was a cricket-obsessed sergeant from Adelaide named Colin Marsh, who had been trying to explain to a new private where an enemy position was located without using any language that an enemy listener could use to vector a response. Marsh, frustrated, had said, "It's like a fielder at fine leg, yeah, about 40 yards out." The private, also Australian, also cricket literate, had looked exactly where Marsh meant and had seen exactly what Marsh was pointing at. Marsh had stared at the private. The private had stared at Marsh. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Marsh said, "Right, so if I said slip, where would you look?" And they spent the next 2 hours in a bunker outside Nui Dat, systematically mapping every fielding position in cricket to a compass bearing and a distance. They told 4 other men. Those men told 6 others. Within 3 months, every Australian patrol in Phúc Tuy province was using cricket fielding positions to describe enemy locations, and not one American officer who monitored their communications had the faintest idea. This was the system that became known, unofficially, and only among the Australians who used it, as calling the field. The Americans heard it and heard cricket conversation, a transmission like, "Reckon there's a silly mid-on about 30 out, another one at deep fine leg maybe 60, sounded, to an American ear, like 2 soldiers arguing about a sporting event that had nothing to do with the war they were currently fighting. To an Australian ear, it was a precise description of 2 enemy soldiers, one positioned 30 meters to the near left of the speaker's forward position, one positioned 60 meters to the far right. Silly mid-on, deep fine leg, gully, square leg, cover point. Each position a bearing, each description of distance a measurement. The conversation that sounded like sport was a targeting brief. The second component was discovered not through deliberate invention, but through one of the most improbable accidents in the history of military communications. It was a Saturday evening in July of 1967. A U.S. Air Force forward air controller named Captain Dennis Whitaker was attempting to coordinate a close air support mission with an Australian SASR patrol that had eyes on a significant enemy concentration near the border of Long Con province. The patrol had called in the contact. The mission had been authorized. The aircraft were 30 minutes out. What happened in the next 40 minutes has been discussed, debated, and retold in the corridors of joint operations centers for decades. The official after-action report describes it in language of remarkable bureaucratic blandness as a communications coordination challenge resolved through non-standard procedures. The non-standard procedures were, in fact, one of the most operationally effective and linguistically bizarre episodes in the history of close air support. The patrol's radio operator was a lance corporal from Queensland named Gary Thornton. Thornton was, by every account of everyone who served with him, an excellent soldier and an enthusiastic drinker. He was not drunk on this particular evening. This point is made explicitly in the official record, which suggests that at some point, someone felt it was necessary to clarify it. He was not drunk. He was simply from Queensland. The first contact between Thornton and Whitaker was standard enough. Call signs were exchanged. The situation was described. The target coordinates were given in standard military grid reference format. Whitaker read them back. Thornton confirmed. Then something went wrong with the radio. Not catastrophically wrong. The frequency did not die. The signal did not drop. What happened was subtler and, from a communications perspective, considerably more interesting. The encryption unit attached to Thornton's radio began intermittently malfunctioning, dropping every fourth or fifth word in an apparently random pattern. The result was that Thornton could hear Whitaker clearly, but Whitaker was receiving a version of Thornton's transmissions that was missing roughly 20% of its content. Whitaker asked for the target coordinates again. Thornton gave them. Whitaker got 3 of the 6 numbers. He asked again. The unit dropped the middle 2. This went on for several increasingly frustrated exchanges. The aircraft burning fuel in their holding pattern, the enemy below unaware that the sky above them was full of Americans who could not understand which specific piece of ground they were supposed to be bombing. Thornton, who was, by his own subsequent description, getting a bit annoyed by this point, tried something different. He knew the aircraft were there. He knew approximately where they were relative to his position. He knew where the target was. What he needed was to give Whitaker a reference that would survive the broken transmission. Something that could be understood even with pieces missing. Something so simple and so specific that not even a malfunctioning radio could obscure it. He picked up the handset and said, "Mate, you know the track that runs north from our pass? Follow it north, about, 2 rounds of drinks worth, maybe 3. Then hang left about 1 round's walk. There's a big bastard tree you can't miss. Targets the building that's shouting distance from the tree's shadow at sunset. You got that?" Whitaker did not have that. Not even close. But his Australian liaison officer, a captain named Peter Sanderson, who was standing 3 feet away and had been listening to the entire exchange with the professional patience of a man who had spent 2 years translating, leaned over and said quietly, "He means approximately 400 meters north-northwest of his position. Target is a structure roughly 50 meters east of a large isolated tree. I can give you the grid." The mission succeeded. The target was destroyed. The after-action report noted the communications difficulty and the non-standard resolution and moved on. But Sanderson, writing in his personal diary that evening, recorded something that the official report had not captured. Thornton's directions were actually perfect, Sanderson wrote. 2 rounds of drinks is 2 shouts. 1 shout is maybe 200 meters of comfortable walking pace for a man who knows where he's going. 1 round's walk left, shouting distance from the tree. He'd given Whitaker everything he needed in language that any Australian would have understood immediately. The problem wasn't the method. The problem was that Whitaker wasn't Australian. Sanderson read that sentence back to himself. Then he wrote underneath it, "Which means, if the VC are listening, they didn't understand it either." He underlined that twice. He took the diary to his commanding officer the next morning. The commanding officer read it. He read it again. He called 3 other officers into the room. They all read it. There was a long silence of the kind that happens when a room full of intelligent people simultaneously realize that something obvious has been sitting in front of them for years. The system had been there all along. Every Australian soldier already knew it. Shouting around was Australian for buying a round of drinks, which was a social obligation undertaken at a specific and understood frequency in Australian drinking culture. A round, in this context, was a unit of social time and social distance. 2 rounds was a walk between pubs. 3 rounds was a longer journey. The mathematics of Australian social drinking, refined through generations of pub culture, corresponded with surprising precision to operational distances at patrol scale. 1 round, in rough translation, meant approximately 200 meters. 2 rounds meant approximately 400. A long shout was roughly 100 meters. A short shout, the distance you could call to someone in a noisy room, was perhaps 25. These were not precise measurements. They were not meant to be. At patrol scale, in jungle terrain, precise measurements were often less useful than accurate relative descriptions, and the relative descriptions embedded in Australian drinking vocabulary were, once you understood the system, extraordinarily accurate. The system spread through the SASR by osmosis. Nobody issued a directive. Nobody held a briefing. Soldiers who knew it used it. Other soldiers heard it used and understood it instinctively because they were Australian. Because the distances made sense to them the way the distances make sense to anyone who has spent a life navigating between pubs and parks and properties in a country where distances are felt rather than measured. American signals teams heard it and heard soldiers talking about drinking. "We thought they were discussing going to the bar," said Sergeant First Class Harold Mills, an American signals analyst who spent 14 months monitoring Australian communications. "Honestly, we thought they were making plans for after the mission. It never occurred to us that 3 rounds was a measurement. Why would it? In English, a round is a round. In Australian, apparently, a round is 200 meters. Nobody told us this. Nobody told them because nobody had decided to tell them." The system had not been authorized. It had not been formalized. It had emerged the way all Australian communication systems emerged, through use, through shared understanding, through the unconscious operation of a culture that had spent a century developing its own internal logic. Gerald Foss, sitting in his office outside Bien Hoa with 11 transcripts spread across his desk, had identified both of these systems by October of 1968. It had taken him 7 months. He had interviewed 6 Australian liaison officers, 3 of whom had found the entire exercise amusing enough to be only intermittently helpful. He had cross-referenced 214 radio transcripts. He had built a working model of the cricket positioning system that was accurate to within roughly 15 degrees of bearing and 20 meters of distance. He had mapped the drinking distance system well enough to use it for rough navigation. He felt briefly like he had cracked something. Then he found the third component. And the third component was something he was not professionally equipped to handle, because Gerald Foss was a man of careful language and institutional correctness. And the third component was built entirely out of words that he had been raised never to use and had spent his adult life actively avoiding. The first indication was in a transcript from August of '68. An SASR patrol was adjusting artillery fire onto a target that had shifted position. The patrol commander, a warrant officer whose name appeared in records only as Kendrick, was speaking to an artillery fire control center. The transmission, transcribed verbatim, read as follows. "Drop about 3 bastards south. Maybe 2 cunts west. Targets in the cunt of the whole thing. Fire for effect when ready. Foss had read this transcript in September and had filed it under communications anomalies, which was his professional way of placing something in a drawer and closing the drawer until he was ready to deal with it. He had not been ready to deal with it. It had taken him 6 more weeks and 11 more similar transcripts to convince himself that the profanity was not incidental. It was not incidental. The system was, once you understood it, so simple that it was almost insulting. Almost. Because the simplicity was the point. The simplicity was the security. It was a measurement system based on the one vocabulary that every Australian soldier shared, regardless of regiment, regardless of state of origin, regardless of rank or education or background. Profanity. Specifically, 2 words. The word bastard, in Australian military usage, described a unit of distance equal to 50 meters. The word that Foss could not bring himself to write in his official report. The word he transcribed in his notes as the C unit, described a unit of distance equal to 100 meters. This was not metaphor. This was not approximate. These were functional measurements, internally consistent, understood by every Australian in the field, and used with the same casual precision that an American engineer would use the words foot and yard. 3 bastards south meant 150 meters to the south. 2 C units west meant 200 meters to the west. 4 bastards in a C unit northeast meant 250 meters to the northeast. The mathematics were simple. The measurements were reliable. The artillery teams using the system knew exactly what was being asked of them, adjusted their fire exactly as instructed, and delivered ordnance onto targets with a precision that Foss, reviewing the after-action reports, found remarkable. He sat with this for 3 days before he wrote anything down. The problem, the specific problem that Foss faced as a trained linguist looking at this system, was that it was brilliant, and he could not say it was brilliant in a CIA report. He could not write, "The Australians have built a functional measurement system out of profanity, and it works extremely well." He could not write that. He tried. He wrote several drafts. He read each one back to himself. He deleted each one. The institutional language of the CIA did not contain the vocabulary necessary to accurately describe what the Australians had done without sounding either unprofessional or, worse, admiring. Because he was admiring. Against every professional instinct, against every analytical inclination toward detachment, Foss found himself genuinely, deeply, in a way he could not entirely suppress, impressed. The system had properties that no designed code could replicate. The first property was universality. Every Australian soldier knew these words. Every Australian soldier had used them since childhood. There was no training required, no code book to memorize, no protocol to learn. The measurement system worked because it was already inside every user's head before they arrived in the field. The second property was deniability. If any American officer challenged an Australian soldier about the language being used on the radio, the soldier could, with complete honesty, say he was simply expressing frustration using ordinary language. Nobody could prove otherwise. The measurements were invisible because they looked exactly like what any Australian soldier would say in any moment of stress or exasperation. The cover was the behavior itself. The third property was the one that haunted Foss. It was the property he eventually described in his report as the obscenity paradox. a term he was reasonably proud of, in the way that a man is proud of a formulation that accurately describes something genuinely strange. The obscenity paradox worked like this. American signals teams monitoring Australian radio traffic were trained to flag transmissions that contained unusual language patterns, coded references, or non-standard terminology. They were specifically trained to look for anything that seemed out of place. Profanity did not trigger this response because profanity was expected. Profanity in a combat radio transmission was background noise. It was the static that everybody heard, and nobody analyzed, because why would you analyze static? The Australians had hidden their measurement system in the one place that American signals doctrine had trained its analysts not to look. In the dirt. In the noise. In the words that every professional intelligence officer had been conditioned since their first day of training to filter out. A Vietnamese signals team intercepting the same traffic faced an even larger problem. Their English training, however extensive, had focused on formal language, military terminology, and standard communication protocols. They had learned the English of textbooks and training manuals, and Roosevelt's speeches. They had not learned the English of Queensland pubs, and Adelaide backyards, and Sydney construction sites. When they heard an Australian transmission dense with profanity, their trained response was to classify it as low-value traffic, the communications of uneducated soldiers using crude language, nothing worth analyzing. They were filtering out the message because the message was wrapped in exactly the kind of language they had been taught to dismiss. Foss wrote in his personal notes, in a passage that did not make it into his official report, "The most remarkable aspect of this system is not that it works. It is that it works for the same reason that it appears not to work. The profanity is not a container for the message. The profanity is the message. The enemy dismisses it because it sounds like noise. And it sounds like noise because to anyone who is not Australian, it is noise. The only people who hear the signal are the people who are already tuned to the frequency before they ever picked up a radio. The only people who hear the signal are the people who are already tuned to the frequency." That sentence took Foss 3 days to write. He was not given to sentimentality. He was not given to literary expression. But sitting in his office in the 3rd month of an investigation that had dismantled most of what he thought he knew about communication security, he needed a sentence that was accurate. And the accurate sentence happened to be almost beautiful. He submitted his report in November of 1968. It ran to 89 pages. It was classified at the highest level available to him. It included detailed analysis of all 3 components, diagrams of the cricket fielding position system, mathematical models of the drinking distance measurements, and a carefully worded section on what he called the profanity metric system that his supervisor read twice, read a 3rd time, and then picked up his phone and called someone more senior. The response from senior CIA leadership was, according to Foss's later account, mixed, in a way that told him everything about how the institution thought about the problem. One faction wanted to replicate the systems. They wanted to take the cricket coordinate method, the drinking distance model, and the profanity measurement grid and formalize them, write them into a manual, train American soldiers to use them. This faction believed the systems were operational assets that the United States should adopt. Foss told them, with the patience of a man who had spent 9 months learning why this idea would not work, that formalizing the systems would destroy them. The moment you put them in a manual, you had created a code book. The moment you had a code book, you had a code. And codes could be captured. Codes could be studied. Codes could be broken. The security of the Australian systems came precisely from the fact that they were not codes. They were behaviors. You could not capture a behavior. You could not put a behavior in a safe and steal it. The behavior lived in the people and changed with the people and died when you tried to pin it down. He had said this. He had written this. He had said it again when they asked him to repeat it. The faction had looked at him with the frustration of people who believed that every problem had a procedural solution, and had just been told that this particular problem did not. The second faction wanted to brief the Australian military and request that they stop using the systems in joint operational contexts, because the systems were creating coordination problems with American forces who could not follow the communications. Foss had thought about this one harder. He had actually written a brief recommending it. Then he had read the brief back to himself and had thrown it away. Because the coordination problems were real, and they were costly, and they had resulted in genuine operational confusion on multiple occasions. But the coordination problems affected American forces operating alongside the Australians. The security advantage affected every enemy listening to Australian communications in every context, in every theater. Asking the Australians to stop using their natural communication systems to make things easier for American forces was asking them to trade total communication security for American convenience. No rational military organization would accept that trade. The Australians certainly would not. Foss had spoken to enough Australian officers to know how that conversation would go. He could hear the response clearly in his head, delivered in the flat, slightly amused tone that Australian officers used when they thought you had said something that only a very stupid person would say, or possibly a very funny one. The third faction, the smallest and the most realistic, simply accepted the situation. Their recommendation was identical to what MacArthur had apparently said 26 years earlier about the same problem in a different war. The Australians are talking. The enemy cannot understand them. Leave it. That faction won, not through argument, through exhaustion. The other factions had run out of procedural solutions and had eventually, reluctantly, concluded that there was nothing to be done. Foss was reassigned in early 1969. Before he left, he did something that was not quite within his authorized activities, but that he felt was necessary for his own professional conscience. He drove out to the Australian Task Force base at Neweydat and spent 2 days talking to the men whose communications he had spent 9 months trying to decode. He talked to soldiers from Victoria and Queensland and Western Australia and New South Wales. He drank their beer. He ate their food. He listened to them talk among themselves. He listened to the cricket references and the drinking references and the profanity that was not profanity. And he heard for the first time, not through a transcript, but in real time in a real room, how completely invisible the systems were when they were in their natural environment. Nobody was performing. Nobody was being deliberately obscure. The men were simply talking. They were talking about the war and about home and about people they knew and about cricket and about drinks they owed each other and about the specific frustrations of military service in tropical heat. And threaded through all of it, invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for, were the coordinates and the distances and the measurements that had defeated the most sophisticated signals analysis operation in American intelligence. On his last evening there, Foss sat with a warrant officer named Kendrick, the same Kendrick who had appeared in the August transcript. Kendrick was a compact man from rural South Australia who had been in the Army for 16 years and had the particular quality of stillness that long service soldiers develop, the ability to sit without fidgeting, to speak without filling silence. Foss told him, "Carefully, and without revealing classified details, that American signals teams had been studying Australian radio communications. Kendrick nodded. Foss told him that the study had found the communications extremely difficult to analyze. Kendrick nodded again. Foss told him that certain aspects of Australian communication had properties that resembled, in their operational effect, a sophisticated encryption system. Kendrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, we're pretty hard to follow." Foss asked him whether the men were aware that they were communicating in ways that were difficult for outsiders to understand. Kendrick thought about it. "Not really," he said. "We just talk. Same way we talk everywhere." He paused. "The Yanks always look a bit lost, though. We noticed that early on." Foss asked whether anyone had ever considered formalizing the methods, writing them down, creating a system from them. Kendrick looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of a man who has just heard a suggestion so foreign to his experience that he is not entirely sure how to respond to it. "Mate," he said, "it wouldn't work if you wrote it down." And that was all he said. He said it without emphasis, without the satisfaction of a man delivering a punchline. He said it the way you state something that is so obviously true that the words are almost unnecessary. It wouldn't work if you wrote it down. Foss had said the same thing in 89 pages. Kendrick had said it in 9 words. The systems continued operating through the end of the Australian involvement in Vietnam. They continued operating, in evolved forms, through subsequent deployments. The cricket vocabulary shifted as new generations of players came through. The drinking references adapted to new cultural contexts. The profanity evolved, as profanity always does, acquiring new words, shedding old ones, absorbing regional variations and generational influences that kept it perpetually current and perpetually inaccessible to anyone consulting a dictionary from 3 years ago. The CIA's Vietnam-era analysis of Australian communications was declassified, in heavily redacted form, in 2003. The section on what the redacting officer had labeled Methodology 3, the section that described the profanity measurement system, was so thoroughly redacted that only fragments survived. The fragments were enough to confirm what Foss had found. They were not enough to explain how it worked. The explanation, apparently, had been considered sensitive enough to remove entirely. Which meant that the most accurate description of the system that remained in the public record was the description in Foss's personal notes, discovered in his papers after his death in 2011, in a box labeled Vietnam Miscellaneous. The note read, "They hid the map in the mud. They hid it in the words that everyone hears and no one listens to. They hid it in the noise. And because nobody listens to noise, nobody found it. The greatest communication security I ever encountered was built from cricket and beer and words I cannot print in an official report. I spent 9 months looking for the code. There was no code. There was just Australia. There is only ever just Australia. And Australia, it turns out, is enough. There was just Australia. The signals kept coming, long after Foss left and long after the war ended. The same flat vowels, the same compressed consonants, the same cricket references and drinking distances and cascading profanity that Americans filed under noise and enemies filed under untranslatable. The language evolved the way it always had, the way it always would, through use and humor and the daily business of men from a specific place talking to each other in the specific way of that place. Somewhere in a forward patrol base in Phuc Tuy province, a radio operator from Brisbane was telling a fire control center that the target was 3 bastards northeast and a long shout from the river bend. The artillery team adjusted their elevation. The round landed exactly where it was supposed to land. The enemy interceptors transcribed the message and classified it as crude language of no intelligence value. The Brisbane radio operator lit a cigarette and called back to say the result was a 6, mate, right on the crease. The fire control center, Australian to a man, understood exactly what that meant. Nobody else did. Nobody else ever would. The after-action report filed the following morning described the fire mission as successfully executed with precise target acquisition. The coordinates listed were in standard military grid reference format. The method by which those coordinates had been communicated was not mentioned. It was never mentioned in any official document. It existed in a category of operational reality that the Australian military had learned through years of institutional experience not to write down, because writing it down would have killed it. This was the central paradox that every Australian officer who thought seriously about the communications problem eventually arrived at. The same paradox that Warrant Officer Kendrick had expressed to Foss in 9 words. The same paradox that had defeated the CIA's Australian Vernacular Project and the Japanese intelligence team before it, and every other institutional effort to systematize what was, fundamentally, a living thing. You cannot document the undocumentable without making it documentable. And the moment it becomes documentable, it becomes breakable. Major Peter Alderton of the Australian SASR understood this better than most. Alderton was 41 years old in 1969, had been in the Army for 22 years, had served in Malaya and Borneo before Vietnam, and had developed over those 2 decades a theory of communication security that he had never written down, had never briefed formally, and had never shared with any American officer. Not out of malice, but out of the same instinctive understanding that Kendrick had expressed. The theory, once articulated, would cease to be true. He articulated it once, to a young signals sergeant named Raymond Voss, on a humid evening outside Nui Dat in the 2nd month of 1969. Alderton had been watching Voss struggle with an American liaison officer who was trying to understand a patrol report that had come in over the radio. The patrol had described a contact using all 3 systems simultaneously: the cricket positions, the drinking distances, and the profanity grid, layered over each other in the way that Australian soldiers naturally layered them when the situation was complex and the need for precision was high. The American liaison officer had a notepad. He was trying to write down what was being said. He was a conscientious man. He was doing exactly what his training told him to do. He was getting nowhere. Alderton watched this for 4 minutes. Then he walked over, listened to the transmission, turned to Voss, and said in a tone of complete normality, "Tell them, 2 bastards south of the 6 hit position, long shout from the gully side. They've got a mid-on and 2 silly mid-offs." Voss relayed this. The patrol confirmed. The American liaison officer stared at his notepad, on which he had written a series of words that had no operational meaning in any language he understood. Later, sitting outside with a cup of tea that had gone cold, Alderton told Voss what he had never told anyone. "The thing about security," he said, "is that everyone thinks it's about keeping secrets. Put the secret in a box, lock the box, guard the box. The more complicated the lock, the better. That's how every army in the world thinks about it. And it works. until someone builds a better lockpick. He drank his cold tea. What we've got is different. We haven't put anything in a box. We've left it out in the open. It's sitting right there on the table for anyone to look at. The difference is that to see what it is, you have to already know what it is. And the only way to already know what it is to be one of us. You can't be taught it. You can't learn it from a book. You either grew up with it or you didn't. And if you didn't, it doesn't matter how long you study it, because by the time you've studied it, it's already moved. Voss, who was 24 and from Toowoomba and had grown up listening to Sheffield Shield cricket on the radio while his father argued about racehorses, said he had never thought about it that way. Alderton said most people hadn't. That was the point. The specific operational history of the three systems in Vietnam is fragmentary, because the systems were never officially acknowledged, which meant they were never officially recorded, which meant the record of their use exists only in after-action reports that describe results without describing methods, in personal diaries that were never intended for institutional eyes, and in the memories of men who were there and who, in many cases, did not fully understand themselves what they had been doing. What is clear from the available record is that the cricket coordinate system was in widespread use across the SASR and attached infantry units by mid-1967, approximately 14 months before Gerald Foss began his analysis. What is also clear is that the system was significantly more sophisticated by the time Foss found it than it had been when Sergeant Colin Marsh and his private had worked it out in a bunker outside Nui Dat. Because the system had evolved. This was the quality that made it genuinely unbreakable. Not the cleverness of the original design, not the cultural opacity of cricket to American and Vietnamese analysts, but the fact that the system was not static. It grew. It changed. It responded to operational experience the way a living language responds to new experience, by developing new vocabulary for new concepts. The original Marsh system had used only the standard fielding positions. By 1967, the SASR had added a layer that Marsh himself later described as the spin bowling extension. A leg spinner's field was different from a pace bowler's field. A defensive field was different from an attacking field. The type of bowler being deployed described the tactical situation of the patrol, whether they were in contact, whether they were observing, whether they were moving toward or away from the enemy. The specific field set for that type of bowling described the enemy's positions within that situation. The number of messages that could be encoded within a single cricket conversation had multiplied by a factor of approximately 6 between 1965 and 1969. A conversation that sounded to any outsider like two men discussing a single over of play could contain a complete patrol report, enemy strength, disposition, direction of movement, estimated distance, and the patrol's own position relative to a known landmark. All of it in cricket. None of it in anything a non-Australian could parse. The drinking distance system had undergone similar evolution. The original framework of rounds and shouts had been supplemented by references to specific pub experiences that encoded additional information. Stumbling distance had a specific meaning. Stone-cold sober walk had a different one. 3 sheets to the wind stagger described both a distance and a terrain condition. The vocabulary of Australian drinking culture, which was itself a rich and highly specific domain, had been mapped onto the operational landscape with a precision that increased with every month of use. And the profanity metric system had expanded in ways that Foss had not fully captured in his 89-page report. Partly because the expansion had happened after he left, and partly because the men who used it were not entirely sure they could explain it to an American, even if they wanted to. The original system had used 2 measurements. By 1969, there were 7. The specific words associated with specific distances had become a gradient, a scale from very small to very large, expressed in the particular vocabulary of Australian profanity that ranged from mild exasperation to extreme emphasis in a gradient that every Australian understood instinctively, and that corresponded, with increasing precision, to distances from 5 meters to 500. A captured North Vietnamese Army signals intelligence assessment from early 1969, discovered in Hanoi archives in the 1990s, and translated by an Australian academic historian, contained a passage about SASR radio communications that was, in the words of the historian who translated it, almost poignant in its frustration. The analyst, identified only by a designation that translated roughly as Senior Technical Officer Nguyen, had written, Australian transmissions from the Phuc Tui operational area continue to defy analysis. The communications appear to consist primarily of sporting references, social discussion, and profanity. Multiple translation attempts have produced results that are internally contradictory. The same phrases appear to mean different things in different contexts, and the contextual rules governing these differences cannot be determined from the transmissions themselves. It is the assessment of this office that Australian voice communications do not contain operationally significant intelligence. Resources devoted to monitoring them are better allocated elsewhere. Do not contain operationally significant intelligence. The Australians were directing artillery fire, reporting enemy positions, coordinating patrol movements, and calling in air support. Every word of it was operationally significant intelligence. Senior Technical Officer Nguyen had listened to all of it and had concluded it was noise. It was noise. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. It was noise, and it was also a complete operational briefing, and the reason it could be both simultaneously was that the difference between noise and information was not in the signal itself. It was in the listener. If you had the key, it was information. If you did not have the key, it was noise. And the key was not a book and not a machine and not a protocol. The key was a childhood. The key was growing up in a country where cricket was the language and the pub was the social unit, and profanity was punctuation, and you either had that childhood or you did not. Senior Technical Officer Nguyen did not have that childhood. Gerald Foss did not have that childhood. Lieutenant Commander Tiata's team in 1943 did not have that childhood. Lieutenant Raymond Holt in 1942 did not have that childhood. And because none of them had that childhood, all of them, despite their intelligence and their training and their institutional resources, reached the same conclusion, 25 years apart, in different wars, against different enemies, studying the same problem. Noise. Move on. There is a particular kind of institutional failure that is not caused by incompetence. It is caused by competence applied to the wrong framework. Foss was not incompetent. He was extraordinarily good at his job. His job was to find codes. He was looking for a code. He was looking for a system with rules that could be extracted and reversed and applied. He found one, eventually, because the Australian systems did have rules. But the rules were not the kind that could be extracted and reversed without the cultural substrate that made them work. The rules lived inside the people who used them. And the people who used them were not the people who needed to extract and reverse them. This was the gap. Not a gap in intelligence, a gap in epistemology, a gap in the fundamental question of what a communication system is and where it lives. Every signals intelligence doctrine in every military in the world in 1968 assumed that a communication system lived outside its users. It lived in a machine, in a book, in a protocol, in a set of rules that could in principle be captured and reversed. The underlying assumption was that the system and the people who used it were separable. You could take the system away from the people and study it in isolation. The Australian systems were not separable from their users. Take them away from Australians, and they stopped working, not because the rules changed, but because the rules were not rules in the conventional sense. They were intuitions, shared understandings, cultural reflexes that operated below the level of conscious decision. You could not put an Australian cultural reflex in a safe. You could not capture it. You could not analyze it in isolation because in isolation it did not exist. Foss had spent 9 months circling this insight without fully articulating it. He had articulated it, in the end, in his personal notes, in the sentence about hiding the map in the mud. But the institutional implications of that insight were something the CIA had not been ready to absorb in 1968. They were something the CIA had never fully absorbed. The insight was this. The Australians had not built security into their communication system. They had built their communication system out of security. The security was not a feature added to the communication. The security was constitutive. It was what the communication was made of. Everything else was a lock on a box. This was a door with no box behind it, and no lock, and no key, because there was nothing to lock and nothing to unlock. There was only a conversation between men who shared a world, and the security of that conversation was identical to the security of that world, which was the security of belonging, which was the security of being from somewhere specific and not somewhere else. And that security was not breakable, because it was not a thing. It was a fact. And facts are not breakable. Facts simply are. The last operational use of all three systems simultaneously in the documented record occurred on the 14th of August, 1969. The SASR patrol involved has never been fully identified in declassified records, but the radio transmission was intercepted by 3 separate monitoring stations: American, Australian, and, it is believed, North Vietnamese, all of which recorded it for different reasons. The American station recorded it as part of routine Allied communications monitoring. The Australian station recorded it because it was a significant contact requiring fire support. The North Vietnamese station, if the declassified assessment is accurate, recorded it because they were tracking a specific frequency. All 3 stations heard the same transmission. The transmission lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. It contained 11 separate pieces of operationally significant information, including enemy strength, position, direction of movement, patrol situation, fire support request with coordinates, and battle damage assessment following the fire mission. All 11 pieces of information were communicated in cricket references, drinking distances, and profanity. The American analysts flagged the transmission as Australian communications, noted cricket and social references, filed it under low-priority Allied traffic, and moved on. The North Vietnamese analysts, if the assessment is accurate, categorized it as crude language, noted no significant intelligence content, and moved on. The Australian Fire Control Center understood every word, fired the mission exactly as directed, confirmed the result, and considered the contact closed. 3 different listeners, 3 different conclusions. One of those conclusions was correct. In 2004, a retired warrant officer named Kevin Doyle published a memoir of his career in Australian signals intelligence. Doyle had served in Vietnam and had subsequently been recruited by the Australian Defence Signals Directorate to study, as he put it, whether the thing could be turned into a thing. His conclusion? That formalizing the systems would destroy them has already been noted. But his memoir contained a passage that went beyond that conclusion. A passage that described something he had observed in the field in 1968 that he had carried with him for 36 years before he found the words for it. He had been sitting in a joint operations center, monitoring a fire mission being coordinated by an SASR patrol. The fire control officer beside him, an American colonel named Whitmore, was following the mission through the official communication channel, which was providing standard grid references and call signs and all the formal apparatus of American fire coordination. The colonel was ticking boxes on a mission brief. Everything was orderly. On a second radio, the Australian radio, the same mission was being coordinated in the 3-system language: cricket positions, drinking distances, profanity that was not profanity. Doyle understood both channels simultaneously. He watched Whitmore follow the official channel. He heard the Australian channel. At a certain point, the 2 channels diverged. The official channel, delayed by the translation process, was running approximately 40 seconds behind the actual tactical situation. The Australian channel was current. A position that had already been confirmed by the Australian channel was still being verified on the official channel. 40 seconds in a fire mission is not nothing. Doyle had turned to Whitmore and had told him, in the careful language of a man translating between worlds, what the Australian channel had already established. Whitmore had looked at him, had looked at the radio, had looked at him again. "How did you know that?" Whitmore had asked. Doyle had thought about how to explain it. "They told us," he had said. "I didn't hear them say that." "No," Doyle had said, "you wouldn't." He had meant it simply, without condescension, without pride, as a plain statement of operational reality. Whitmore had not heard it, because Whitmore was not equipped to hear it. Not through any fault of his own, not through any deficiency of intelligence or training or commitment, but because the channel through which the information had traveled was a channel that Whitmore did not have and could not get. You either grew up with it or you didn't. Whitmore, in Doyle's account, had sat quietly for a moment. Then he had said something that Doyle remembered verbatim because it was, he felt, the most honest thing an American officer had ever said to him about the Australian communication situation. Whitmore had said, "That's the most unfair advantage I've ever seen." Doyle had thought about that. "It's not really an advantage," he had said. "It's just what we are." Whitmore had considered this. "Yeah," he had said. "That's what makes it unfair. That's what makes it unfair." The fairness or unfairness of inherent cultural characteristics as operational advantages is not a question that military doctrine is well equipped to address. Doctrine is written for things that can be replicated, for systems that can be transferred, for advantages that can be distributed across a force, through training and equipment and protocol. An advantage that lives in culture, that is grown rather than built, that cannot be transferred or replicated or distributed because it is identical to the people who have it and inseparable from the history that made them. That kind of advantage sits outside the categories that doctrine was designed to process. The Americans processed it by assigning Australian liaison officers, by embedding Australian signals personnel in joint operations. By creating structured translation mechanisms that allowed the two forces to operate alongside each other without requiring American soldiers to understand what was happening on the Australian radio net. The system worked. It was clumsy and slow and required a human intermediary for every significant operational exchange. And it worked because the alternative was not understanding at all. And not understanding at all was operationally unacceptable. But it never solved the underlying problem. Because the underlying problem was not solvable. The underlying problem was that two allies were speaking different languages while using the same words. And the differences between those languages were not in the vocabulary or the grammar or the pronunciation. They were in 20 years of cricket on the radio, and 30 years of pubs, and a lifetime of a specific kind of profanity that carried specific meaning in a specific landscape that was not this one. Gerald Foss, in his personal notes, in a passage that came after the famous mud sentence, wrote something that he never showed anyone. He wrote, "I have spent most of my professional life trying to understand how communications systems work. I have studied codes and ciphers and encryption protocols and frequency management and every technical aspect of the problem that formal training could address. And I have concluded, sitting in a small office outside Benoit with 11 transcripts that I still cannot fully decode, that the most important element of any communication system is not the system. It is the shared experience that allows the system to mean anything at all. Every code is a shorthand for an experience. Every cipher is a compressed version of a world. What the Australians have done, without knowing they were doing it, is to make their shared experience so dense and so specific and so continuously evolving that no compression of it is possible. You cannot compress what you do not have. You cannot decode what you have not lived. The map is not the territory. The code is not the experience. And the experience is not available for purchase or study or analysis. I can go home. I can never go back. The Australians are always already there. The Australians are always already there. The transmission from the 14th of August, 1969, the last documented simultaneous use of all three systems, has been listened to by a number of people over the years. Researchers and historians and intelligence analysts who found the recording in archives and understood, at least intellectually, what they were hearing. None of them could decode it in real time. Several of them, working from Foss's analysis and subsequent research, could reconstruct what had been communicated after the fact, laboriously, with reference materials and time and the cold analytical distance of historical reconstruction. But none of them could hear it the way the Australian Fire Control Center heard it, which was as plain speech, clear and immediate and obvious, the way water is obvious when you are thirsty and you know what water is. The recording is 4 minutes and 17 seconds long. A man from Brisbane talks about cricket and beer and uses words that cannot be printed in a family publication. Another man confirms. A third man adds information about the distance to a particular tree. A result is called in. The voices are unhurried. There is a brief laugh at one point. The transmission ends. 11 pieces of operationally significant information. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. A laugh. You would have to have been there to understand it. Not at the recording, not at the fire mission. You would have to have been there at every Saturday afternoon cricket match, and every round of drinks, and every barbecue where the language was what it was, and the distances meant what they meant, and the profanity was both exactly what it sounded like and exactly not what it sounded like. You would have to have grown up. And if you had grown up there, in that specific there, you would not need this explanation. And if you had not, no explanation would ever be enough.